Hillary has been lengthening her excuses as to why she lost the election. She didn't really lose the election. It was stolen from her by, I think it's up to 24 different excuses she has now. Number 24 is content farms in Macedonia. And as I said, my grandfather was a Macedonian content farmer, and we often think about, gathering on the porch and recalling the old days on the Macedonian. He never thought that the old content farmers he left behind in Macedonia would one day steal the U.S. presidential election. They are gnarled, hard-working Macedonian peasants, and the way they were able to reach out.
It's a Mad World is a 1963 slapstick American comedy by director Stanley Kramer. It's also my favorite film in the whole wide world, and I've seen it probably 50 times. Clocking in at 3 hours and 30 minutes, it even has an intermission. The basic premise of the film is a chase for $350,000 in buried cash, buried under a, quote, Big W, unquote, in Santa Rosita State Park in Southern California near the Mexican border. A random group of 4 vehicles with varying occupants learns about this cache when a speeding driver, Smiler Grogan, brilliantly played by Jimmy Durante, drives over a twisting mountain as he tries to escape police pursuit. He had been in jail for 15 years, but on this fateful day he slipped his escort and made a run for it. Right after he crashes, these 4 vehicles stop and the men clamber down the hill to see if they can help him. Smiler dies shortly thereafter, but not before he tells them the story of this fabulous treasure and tells the men that they can have it, it's theirs. This sets up the entire film, a mad dash for the mysterious Big W in Santa Rosita State Park. Along the way, the various occupants of the vehicles pick up other random folks who have become involved in a hilarious chase, while the police chief following Grogan, Captain Culpepper, wonderfully played by Spencer Tracy, has his forces following the hapless motorists and those they pick up. Right before the intermission, halfway through the film, the audience is treated to a series of quick scenes of the original 4 vehicles and their occupants and those they've picked up, all in various states of distress as they continue their mad dash to the Big W. And that is what it feels like in the world today. A series of crises swirling around the world, but especially in the West, with no end in sight and with no one knowing how it will all turn out. Lord Ashcroft writes in the UK's Daily Mail on Saturday, September 28, and regarding Brexit in general, quote, "It is a good rule of thumb in politics that the noisier it gets, the more it pays to take a step back, a deep breath, and a good look at the bigger picture," unquote. We agree. We'll discuss all of this and little else on this special episode of the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast. I'm Jason Miko, coming to you from the foot of the Catalina Mountains in Oro Valley, Arizona.
And this is Cvetin calling in from Skopje, Macedonia. And I also think we should have bought the squirrel because we're seriously being lost at this point. And there is no getting back on the road the way things are going.
Exactly. You know, Cvetin, all countries throughout history, all empires, all countries die by suicide. As Lincoln famously told the young men at the Young Men's Lyceum in, I think it was 1820 something or other, that a country must live forever or die by suicide. I'm just reading right now an article in The Guardian, the UK's Guardian. The head of politics at Cambridge University has called for children as young as 6, not 16, 6, to be given the vote in attempts to tackle the age bias in modern democracy. Seriously. This man, who is the head of politics at Cambridge University, is calling for 6-year-olds to be given the right to vote. Now,
I heard somewhere that the Labour Party now wants to have every resident, or even former resident, if I understood it well, to be given the right to vote. And actually, I attended some English language school there in the UK almost 20 years ago, or actually, it's 20 years. No, yeah, it's 20 years ago, and for a few weeks, and who knows? Maybe I have the right to vote in the United Kingdom now.
Oh well, yeah. This gets to the whole issue of the idiots and I should call them the blithering idiots in academia and think tanks and others, even politicians and faceless bureaucrats around the world who talk about, well, we shouldn't have borders and people should be able to live in whatever country they want and it's all one big world anyway. But I think all of this just points, as we just talked about, to the suicide of nations. We see what's going on here in the United States with the continued attempt. Look, the Democrat Party and their allies in the media and the overculture and think tanks and academia and universities everywhere have been attempting to get rid of Trump since before he was inaugurated. There's actually been impeachment movements afoot in December of 16, and a month before he was inaugurated. And so this is all part of Trump derangement syndrome. This latest scandal with Ukraine and Hunter Biden. I think one thing is for sure, that this is not going to be good for Joe Biden, and we can talk about that in a minute. But we see the current manifestation of Trump derangement syndrome and how it is totally divided and will continue dividing the United States. We see Brexit and the EU's attempt, and the Europhiles within the UK, their attempt to thwart the will of the people to keep the UK in the EU. We see, as we talk about on this podcast every week, the attempt by the government of Zoran Zaev and his enablers in and outside of Macedonia to thwart the will of the people, the consent of the governed, the hallmark of democracy, to basically remove from Macedonia any vestige of history, culture, heritage, certainly the name and the identity, etc. And it just seems like in every country in the West, this is going on. It's that series of crises that are going on in every country in the West today, and nobody knows where it's going and what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, in your country, it's a deep state coup. I mean, I'm not using these words lightly. It's definitely a coup. In the United Kingdom, something similar is happening. I didn't even know they have a Supreme Court. I know there is something like this Privy Council or whatever they call it. I've honestly, had to Google it. I consider myself a relatively informed person about oddities and stupid things like this. And I never knew they had a Supreme Court until they had it.
You're not the only one, and you're to be forgiven. This is, I think it was Dan Hannan earlier this week wrote that if you tell the average Brit that the Supreme Court the other week voted this, that, or the other, they would say, we have a Supreme Court? I think it's worth pointing out to our listeners that the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom has only been around for 10 years. And it's also important to remind listeners, the UK does not have a written constitution. It is a series of traditions and culture and other things going back 1,000 years that have given it what we call its constitution. So that is part of the
But this is like literally set up yesterday, right?
The UK, the Supreme Court, and guess who set it up?
The left, I suppose.
Tony Blair. Tony Blair, who is actively lobbying to keep the UK in the EU. I mean, he's definitely trying to thwart the will of the people. So now I don't know the finer points of UK law, but I would recommend any number of conservative leaders in the UK that could talk about this, including Dan Hannan. I'd have to go back and find the article and explain why it was basically a political decision, and it wasn't right. So anyway, we're recording this on Sunday, the 29th of September. So Brexit is supposed to happen in just over 32 days, on October 31.
But we're broadcasting this on September 30th.
Yes.
And that's the 1-year anniversary of our referendum. You're usually the one who's good with the dates, but
you're right.
Speaking of the voice of the people being denied, we are broadcasting on the day when Macedonians voted with their feet by not using them. Opted to make Ivar for the winter months instead of going to vote in the referendum, where the question was, do you support joining EU and NATO through the Prespa Treaty as the Republic of North Macedonia? And only 36% of us voted. Out of this, easily 5 or 6% were stuffed ballots by in the Albanian districts, and the threshold was obviously 50%, so it was a clear rejection of the not only the idea to rename the country, but also even you could argue, to join EU and NATO under these conditions. So it was a complete slap in the face of everybody who came here to pressure us to join, to sign on to this adventure, which includes no adventure sounds too interesting to this humiliating betrayal of everything that's dear to us, to all our national interests. We had Angela Merkel come here on our Independence Day, 8th of September, and tell us in our faces, you go vote on the 30th. And she didn't even sweeten the deal by offering some money or anything. It was surreal, honestly. We had James Mattis, we had all of the useless European politicians, and we said no to all of them.
Exactly. It was, as I love pointing out, talking about interference in Macedonia's internal affairs and in the referendum, it was Mattis, Merkel, May, Mogherini. Now, what was not there? The Prime Minister of the boogeyman, Russia, Medvedev, did not come. No Russians came. So it was just the Westerners that were there saying, quote unquote, there is no alternative. Zaev, of course, said, if this is Zaev's attitude towards Macedonians. He said, and I quote, if you don't vote, you don't count. No. That's his dismissive, arrogant, son of a attitude towards Macedonians. And the consent of the governed is a hallmark of any democracy, and you ignore the consent of the governed in Macedonia, and as we see in the UK, and by the Democrat Party and their mouthpieces here in America, the consent of the governed, and you ignore that, and you trample on that, and you start, and that destroys the very institutions that hold up democracy, which is under it. Those institutions and our way of life in democratic countries is under attack by these very people.
Yeah, we had it in Greece when they voted in the referendum against embarking on this process of cutting spending and paying back them. I mean, okay, that's that was. But again, they voted to leave the euro essentially with their referendum, and they were denied. In Italy now, they're not even allowing them to have the vote. I mean, the great unwashed, the masses, they vote by now regularly against the establishment. But then through this trickery, such as inventing a new court which will, or inventing the right of a court in Hawaii to undermine a clear order by the U.S. president, which has always been respected in regards to close the border, regulate entry to the country. In the United Kingdom, I said they invented a new court.
Right.
In our situation, it was far more brutal than all of this. There was no pretense of going through some democratic process. It was just arrest the required number of members of parliament and keep them in prison until they break and agree to vote, to subvert the vote of the people. So yeah, it's one global struggle with a large number of smaller front lines across the world, and it's not going to end well.
No, it isn't.
There is no way this ends well.
And I think if we can try and kind of pinpoint it again, where, as I alluded to in the monologue, what Lord Ashcroft said about trying to take a step back and look at it from, as we often talk about, a 30,000 foot, 10,000 meter perspective. It's always a good idea because the news cycle doesn't stop. It's not a well, it used to be a 24-hour news cycle, and then it was a 24-second news cycle, and it's not even that. It just keeps going. And so, taking a step back and looking at all these crises, there's a common theme, I think, and the common theme is that there's a certain number of elites, mainly from the left, but some from the right as well, that want to create this global governance, not global government, but global governance, and with them at the top in power. And it's very similar to, and they do it all in the name of, quote, freedom and democracy. But the way they want to do this is by ignoring the will of the people, or through literal wars, or through, as we've seen in the case of Macedonia and other countries, constant social engineering, of forcing what they believe to be right against the will of the people on these other countries. But it's all about, at the end of the day, it's all about power and keeping them in power.
Sure.
And to your point, yes, it's not going to end well. Now, what can we do about this other than we just keep fighting, which I know is exhausting. I can tell you that most Americans are completely fed up with the charade that has been going on since before President Trump was elected. This constant attempt to get rid of him. We just went through 2 years of the Mueller probe, and that ended up with nothing. Russia, and nothing. They tried to impeach. The Attorney General, Barr. What's his first name? Oh dear.
Yep. Bill
Barr.
Barr.
William Barr. They tried to impeach him. They tried to impeach Brett Kavanaugh, the new Supreme Court justice. Now they're trying to impeach Donald Trump. It's this constant, and of course the blowback that they're going to face, I think, is that the American people are going to say enough, dosta. We're sick and tired of all this. Just lay off and let. In terms of an impeachment, we're just a year and a month away from an election. Let the people decide in November of 2020 what's going to happen. In the UK's case, I don't know. You and I follow it quite closely, but I just can't tell you what's going to happen. I don't know. In Macedonia's case, which we talk about on this podcast every week, which we write about and post and reshare news stories every day. I don't know, and we saw that Zaev was in New York this week at UNGA. I don't know if he's still there or not. Pretending to be a world leader and whatnot, and obviously seeking praise and adulation from other leaders around the world, and getting none of the above, of course. And how this is all going to be undone in Macedonia, I'm not sure, but I'm convinced it's going to be undone because it has to be undone.
Yes, I told you I'm getting PTSD in a sense from the latest scandal in the U.S. because the similarities are so stark here, and we don't know how it's going to end, but we can go through what's been happening and things where we have our very different countries going in parallel through similar developments. So essentially, you have in the U.S. the first national security advisor to the president being charged. Was he arrested for a while? I'm not sure.
Michael Flynn?
Yeah,
I don't know.
You have his personal lawyer, Cohen. You have the head of his electoral campaign. Manafort is in prison, allegedly in solitary prison.
Yes.
This is a very his children, at least one of his sons, for sure faced being charged, arrested. So this is a significant number of people around the president who are being arrested. Not to mention that apparently he can pick up the phone without a CIA agent not only informing the opposition what's happening and the opposition press, but now even going public, maybe looking for a book deal or trying to topple him. This is an administration, a bureaucratic state in revolt against the president. Mm-hmm. Whereas here we had something similar. We had intelligence agents in the UBK wiretapping the government and then feeding the information to the opposition in clear coordination with the U.S. And other embassies in Macedonia to orchestrate a political crisis to bring down the government. We have an unprecedentedly high number of members of parliament who were arrested, face all sorts of charges in order to turn from the opposition and join in with the government in order to vote to rename the country. So it's an unprecedented assault on the opposition party, or even while Trump is in power, it's clear that we on the right are in the opposition, even though we may nominally be in power at times, but it's clearly that we do not control the bureaucracy. And then if you look at Ukraine, what happened there was a colored revolution, very similar to what was orchestrated in Macedonia, which included U.S. government grants, to protesters in the streets, clear support from the embassy to the protesters. In our case, it was by Jess Bailey. In the case of Ukraine, it was by Ambassador Geoffrey Piat, who is now the U.S. ambassador to Greece and was involved in finishing the job with Macedonia on the Greek end, pursuing the majority in parliament to push through the Prespa Treaty. He was moved from Ukraine to Macedonia. And Ukraine was a year before, I think they had like a year until elections when the Maidan happened, and they could have waited. The U.S. could have supported the opposition, but allowed things to run their course through elections. There is precedent in this country where a government which supports the pro-Russian element in the country would lose elections, and then after some pressure would eventually withdraw and allow the pro-Ukrainian, Western powers to take over. It happened once before. So they could have waited. Instead, there was an orchestrated colored revolution. I think 13,000 people by now have been killed. There is occupation, etc. You cannot cheat the pro-Russian elements in the country from their electoral win and their government without them seceding at places. So it was a complete disaster. And the part which maybe affects me mostly emotionally here is that we see this once the government was toppled, once essentially a new government was appointed by the West. What happens? Biden rolls in and he says, okay, what do you have here in terms of financial resources? Where can we make the money? And he appoints his lunatic son to run, to the board of an oil and gas company to start milking it for what it's worth. In our case, we don't have oil, we don't have, major companies, but we are seeing that the prosecutors, which were appointed by the U.S. government here, by U.S. diplomats such as Bailey and David Stevenson, we see that they've been going from one company to the other, knocking on doors, checking in their financial resources, and essentially impounding them, essentially confiscating them by threatening local companies with criminal charges, the owners of the companies with criminal charges, unless they pay up. There is no way in hell this money were not shared with the U.S. diplomats who essentially created the Special Prosecutor's Office. So we have a gangster mentality spreading from Washington across the world, taking over countries, and there is no ideological fight here. You can't argue that Ukraine is now more free market or more conservative now that it's turned away from Russia and has a pro-European, pro-American government. It's just kleptocracy. The U.S. is sending out diplomats across the world, and they're in this to make money. And this is, I don't know what to say, honestly.
Yeah, here's an interesting point. You mentioned that I don't think it's quite right that Biden didn't install his son on the board of the Ukrainian gas company, Burisma. I think it's Burisma. I think is the name of it. He didn't install him. I mean, Hunter, and we're talking about Hunter Biden. So just so for listeners know, Hunter Biden is Joe Biden's surviving son. His oldest son, Beau, who was, I think, the Attorney General of Delaware at one point, passed away from a brain tumor, I believe, in 2015. He was a good man, and a good family man. And look, the Biden family has had tragedy, lots of tragedy in their life. But what happened in this particular situation as it relates to Ukraine and the Bidens, Biden's son, Hunter, who has a real shady past. So he was kicked out of the Navy for drug use. He's a substance abuser. He divorced his first wife, he had 3 daughters with her. After his brother Beau died in 2015, within 3 months, Hunter Biden was then dating his sister-in-law, Beau's ex-wife, and they were together for a couple of years, and it's a bit gross, I think. And then he's on the board of this gas production company, and he has no background in energy or gas production, and according to media reports, he was paid $50,000 a month. Now, the whole point of putting him on this, of him getting on this board of this firm, was so that it could give the firm a patina of legitimacy and Western, Western stamp of approval in so many words, because it's got the vice president's son on it. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is where it gets fun. The great, actually, I'm surprised I'm actually going to say this, Cvetin, but a great article in the Washington Post today that it's very detailed in terms of just kind of laying out the timeline and things like that, and that's why it's good. But it mentions that Burisma, the Ukrainian gas firm who Hunter Biden was on their board, started making donations to a think tank in Washington, D.C. Guess what the name of that think tank was? The Atlantic Council. Now, the Atlantic Council, they just finished giving out their, literally they call it, the 10th anniversary of their Global Citizen Awards. And the Atlantic Council is one of these think tanks in Washington, D.C. And the Atlantic Council has been very much, Damon Wilson, very much a proponent of Macedonia changing its name. But very much, and the award says it all there, Global Citizen Award. They're very much of this belief that they want that it is their crusade, and I'm using that word deliberately, to make the world quote unquote safe for democracy, and they're going to do it by force, by war, or through social engineering, or through installing their people and people that think like them in various countries, etc. But it's just funny, ironic, odd, whatever you want to call it, to see that this firm, which has got a shady past apparently in Ukraine, and now has at that time has Hunter Biden as the sitting vice president's son on its board, and then they start making donations to the Atlantic Council. It's all incestuous. That's what it is. And to your point about David Stevenson, who I wish nothing but ill will for, and I'm surprised that he's still around. And at some point, he knows that at some point Vumro is going to come to power, and they're going to investigate him and what he has been doing, etc. And it's all going, it's going to come out, and it would be better for him to leave the country, I think.
I mean, I guess they figure they run the country by now. I'm just like Damon McWilson was supporting.
Is it Wilson or McWilson? I always forget.
I'm not sure. Who cares? They don't care about our names, so why would they care about his? But the way they're picking prosecutors in Ukraine, the same way they're picking prosecutors in Macedonia, and it's clearly the U.S. is apparently no longer in a position to pressure countries and wield hard power through the military. It's clear what the mentality of the public is there for yet another military intervention. So obviously the U.S. is not going to war anytime soon again. But the way the U.S. wants to control countries now is through prosecutors, and they send you some journalists like The Economist, the Financial Times, to declare one side corrupt, the other side being pro-Western, etc. They appoint a few prosecutors, they send intelligence agents, they manufacture evidence against the side they don't like, they cover up the evidence against the side that they do like, and this is how the U.S. at this point intends to control countries. Where it will collapse, like in Syria and in other places, and God forbid you cross them and play your cards wrong during this colored revolution takeover of your country, you end up like Eastern Ukraine or Syria, is where you say, okay, but are you willing to commit hard power to follow through on what you are starting, on this fight you're starting in my country? Apparently they will not. Apparently it's a problem to even sell weaponry to Ukraine. So you will likely end up with a civil war because the U.S. is using soft and semi-soft power, intruding in territories where countries like Russia, Iran, China would respond with hard power. And, we could have very easily ended up with a civil war in Macedonia, and we could very easily end up still. It was essentially Vumro retreating that prevented another Kumanova, which is essentially what the U.S. is threatening countries with. and it's a completely despicable situation to be. It's a superpower in a decline, in a stage where it's a liability for security around the world.
Oh, sure, yeah, and again, going back to the quote from Lincoln on suicide. Yeah, I mean, all countries die by suicide. That's just a fact of history. And the U.S. is bitterly divided. And it's not just, this didn't just happen with Trump. I think it's important to point that out. This has been going on for at least 50 or 60 years, if not longer. You could, I know Jonah Goldberg likes to trace this back to the election of Woodrow Wilson, our first fascist president, by the way. So literally 100 years. But you can certainly then point to the 60s and the cultural revolution, the sexual revolution, and all of that has been going on that has eroded the basic institution of any society that holds up all of the physical man-made institutions. And of course, the basic institution of any society, the building block, of course, is the family. It's not the individual, actually. It's the family, because we don't come into this world alone, and most people don't leave this world alone. And throughout their journeys through life, all of us have lots of people around us, starting with our family and then going out from there. But it's that family that holds, that keeps the society from imploding and falling apart. But once you start undermining that basic institution, the family, then everything else falls apart. It's no wonder that we see our institutions in such distress today, because the family has been attacked for at least 50 years, if not longer.
Yeah.
But gosh.
On a broader scale, at least before, in the past 50 years, we had an ideological fight. So we could argue that, okay, you have one extremely corrupt, crooked, anti-civilizational ideology, and everything else which would happen, every other wrong which could be done by the side opposing the East, opposing communism, could be excused away by, okay, we're fighting this huge evil and which needs to be defeated. But now there is nothing like that, or you could argue that the U.S. picked a worthy fight to reform, to transform the Islamic world, but then gave up on it. And now it's picking fights with countries which are, not much worse off than the United States. In some instances, you could argue even more free market or more individualist, less. Had drunk less of the Kool-Aid, which has apparently been consumed by the U.S. Maybe China to some extent would be considered a worthwhile opponent, but it's not. I suppose it's not at the level of what the USSR was, and lacking this civilizational fight. What's left and what everybody sees in the actions of the U.S. diplomacy is just this pure gangsterism, nothing more. And welcome back to the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast. Cvetin and Jason, Miko discussing Ukraine by now, throughout the entire podcast so far. But Ukraine as it relates to Macedonia and other, and we've seen all this. We've seen this repeat itself in Kosovo, in Serbia, in Croatia, and other Balkan countries as well. So it's we would say isto drugo pakovanja. It's a Serbian comment, which I will not translate here, but it's the same going around in different countries. But since this is the Macedonian Content Farmers podcast, and we should have some news on Macedonia more locally, I will just tick off some of the important things happening in the past week, and because again, there was quite a lot of things happening. Jason mentioned Zaev at the United Nations, and we had a break with what was the traditional approach by Macedonian leaders at the United Nations General Assembly, where presidents, even those from the left, prime ministers, they would always use this opportunity to address the world, to repeat that we are Macedonia, and as a nation we are Macedonians, and that we are unfairly pressured by the Greeks to change our name. During Zaev's speech at the UNGA, during which even his entourage, his wife and everybody, were checking their phones instead of listening to the prime minister. This was the first time he insisted that we are now North Macedonia, and he tried to portray this like a huge success which will bring peace and freedom and love eternal in the Balkans. We have a series of criminal charges, assaults against media outlets such as Infomax, Republika. Netpress was raided by the police.
Yes.
The reason for all of this happening is that these are critical outlets which are reporting on Zaev's corruption, the racketeering scandal. They're asking questions: why haven't more SDSM people been investigated, and why hasn't any of them been charged with the crimes in the first and now in the second racketeering scandal? So obviously the response by the Zaev regime is to send the police and the prosecutors against the journalists. This even prompted a response from the OSCE freedom of media representative, which was completely unexpected. He's usually a reliable lefty supporter. We have the final breakdown of the 2015 wiretapping scandal. Zoran Verushevsky, the spy master who orchestrated the whole thing, was testifying in court, and he actually acknowledged that the tapes which Zaev and his SDSM party were using in 2015 were heavily edited or heavily modified, is the phrase he used. He's trying to put some distance between himself and the recordings, and especially another of the people who were conducting the wiretapping, Joko Lazarevsky, who was more personally involved in doing the wiretapping. So for some reason, Verushevsky is furiously backpedaling and withdrawing himself from the entire scandal. This all essentially blows up the entire argument in favor of the colored revolution, in favor of bringing down the Weimar government. Many of the tapes have individually been debunked, like the one about the murder of Martin Nishkovsky that was allegedly a cover-up according to Zaev, or the death of Nikola Mladenov. These have been debunked. The 2012 Good Friday massacre, this has all been debunked so far, and now the organizer of the entire political crisis says that, well, yeah, it was all a lie. Back to
you didn't mention Racket too.
In this scandal, it turns out that one of the persons who was involved in the first racketeering scandal, Zoran Milevsky, nicknamed Zoki Kiches, that's the big tall guy who is carrying the bag of money for Boki 13 when they were extorting money from the businessman Orce Kamčov. So he's literally the bagman in this scandal.
The Louis Vuitton bags.
He's now being charged, accused by the owner of this dialysis company who was sold for 11 million to a Swedish company, and was apparently faced extortion attempts from the healthcare minister, from the head of the healthcare fund, because they said, okay, you got so much money here, that's not, in this country you have to render unto Caesar, render unto Zaev if we see you carrying so much money there. So apparently they sent the same person who was extorting money from Boki 13, from Orce Kamčov, to extort money from this dialysis provider, which again tells us that this was a key person sent by the government to extort money from businesses. This person is married to this flamboyant model, is allegedly, some kind of a sexual, like Boki 13 as well, famous for his gun collection. So he's quite a gangster character apparently. So now we have both scandals rolled into one, and the narrative, the consequence is clear. The government was going after any company in this country which had a bank account of more than 6 figures, and they were shaking them down using one and the same group of people to do this. And the latest thing we were just now watching on my feed here is that this famous journalist who was the victim of the regime of the Gruevski government, Tomislav Kezarovski, everybody was running to his support because he allegedly published something very important which nobody could explain why it's important. He just assaulted a journalist a few days ago, and the video is just now being revealed. He attacked a journalist who was supporting Zaev, but then turned on Zaev when she said, listen, this is what's happening here is crazy. So he apparently waited for her in front of her friend's house, berated her in the car, and she says, okay, he's a coward, so she says, I told him to go pound sand, and he did. So, this is, things are going quite interestingly here in my country.
Well, as we kind of talked about at the beginning, the 30,000 foot, 10,000 meter perspective of all these crises going on in the world. Now you've just gone through a litany of crises going on in Macedonia, and any one of those we could probably dedicate a whole podcast to. I just want to touch on, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the two scandals, Racket 1, Racket and Racket 2. They're linked through the bagman. And we still don't know, by the way, the money that Kamchev gave. Then we see the pictures of Boki and others walking out of his house with the bags, the Louis Vuitton bags full of money. We still don't know where that money went. It shouldn't be that difficult to figure that out, eh?
I suppose that the bag was wired, and that Orza Kamchev knows where it went, and a number of intelligence agencies. I suppose they're haggling over how this thing unfolds, and depending on what Orts is asking from the government, or obviously Kichets as well, the evidence will surface or not surface depending on how these negotiations go. Kichets was released from detention into house arrest, so he apparently made some sweetheart deal with the government.
Well,
maybe he was using this bit of information.
Wow. Well, that's it's just, and I understand that the whole racket scandal has the prosecutors say that they have completed their investigation. Is that correct? And we're just waiting for them to.
They said they know everything, except they've only interrogated Boki 13 and Katica once, and they actually refused to testify.
Right.
So they interrogated 2 SDSM party officials and 2 of their mayors, but charged nobody. And they're preparing to call it a day, even though it's not. They haven't even scratched the surface.
Well, the people aren't going to forget this. This is just going to be this open bleeding wound for the government that is just going to continue to ooze pus and blood, and people aren't going to forget that. Not to mention the ongoing scandals with the media, Racket 2. Where does all that go? It doesn't look good for Zoran Zaev and his people.
Yeah, the polls have turned decisively against him.
But he
hopes, I suppose.
Yeah, and he refused. But he's refusing to hold early elections, right?
Oh yeah, of course. He will try to. He said October, but he will probably try to postpone it until December, which is the last time he can do it without declaring martial law or something, which is also not out of the question. He should resign 3 months before the elections, so that should be around New Year if we have elections in March, April, as Vimera demands, or in over the summer if elections are held in October. He will probably refuse to do so. He will probably refuse to resign under the Pershina deal. He will try to hang on to power for his dear life, and but it's only making it worse for him because the more.
Yeah, this is the thing. I mean, eventually everybody loses power. That's just a fact of life. Just like I said, eventually every country commits suicide. That's also a fact of life. And so, if he is just maybe he's maybe it is the cannabis the marijuana he's smoking. He just literally thinks that he's going to be around forever, and that all these things are going to go away, and that's not only is it arrogant, it's just plain ignorant as well. But that's Zoran Zaev for you, an arrogant, ignorant little man. And so, oh, hang on here, I got a text message from my Ukrainian contacts. Got it.
Oh yeah, sure.
I'll answer it later. Anyway,
here's the money. Okay. Is it wired yet?
So, well, gosh, I think we could talk about each one of those scandals throughout the a separate podcast for each one. But I think we're going to kind of set that aside for now. I just want to point out, I just see some good news here. I think it's good news. As you know, I follow the Brexit scandal. I see that and the Conservative Party is having their conference now, I believe. And Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is a Tory leader of Commons, he has said, this is a great quote, "I think the problems with the euro are so deep-seated that the current European Union project, can't last long into the future."
Yeah. And
that's something that we've talked about quite a bit and written about, how the EU as a project cannot continue.
We'll be happy to join it now and help push it over the cliff, because that's how it's going to play out.
Yeah, well.
I mean, I always hated when SDSM would go around the world and say, listen, Macedonia is not prepared to join the EU. We're not worthy. Look at the crime, corruption, Bevamara. And I said, come on, guys, stop it. And I'm not willing to go in this direction against SDSM. I do not hate my own country like they do. But this is really a ridiculous level of corruption. Just the number of members of parliament who are arrested is out of this world. Nothing west of the Caspian Sea is comparable to what we have here. But still my position is, no, actually, yes, please let us join. We'll be happy to join and show you a thing or two once we are in, because this is really a joke.
Well, let's take a quick break and then come back and go through our farmer's picks.
And welcome back to the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast. Cvetin and Jason, Miko on the line. It's time for our farmers picks. Jason, you're usually the one to send our listeners off with something positive and uplifting, because all I got is, is bile and anger and sanguinic.
So
take it away.
So we'll have a farmer's pick this week. And this one is a bit interesting. This is really it's for everybody, but if you are in the Phoenix, Arizona area next Sunday, October 6th, you won't want to miss this. So, my friend Vanya Nikolovsky is the new conductor of the Chandler Symphony Orchestra. Now, Chandler is a small community basically attached to Phoenix. Phoenix has a lot of small communities around it. But Vanya and his family are Macedonians. He is the new conductor of the Chandler Symphony Orchestra, and he is premiering a new piece of music next week, and it is called Karchner Caverns Magic, and it's the U.S. premiere. Now, Karchner Caverns is in southeastern Arizona. It is a series of caves that were only discovered in the 1970s, and they are incredible. There's two main caves. They're open to the public. It's part of the Arizona State Park system. They're just absolutely beautiful. I've been to both of them, and I'm sorry to say, actually, I've never been to the caves at Matka, and I know that those are now open to the public. Maybe when I first came there in the 90s, they weren't. I can't remember. But anyway, the Karchner Caverns State Park, beautiful caving system. And when Vanya went there many years ago, he was just absolutely blown away and inspired. And so he wrote an entire musical score to honor Karchner Caverns. And the U.S. premiere will be next Sunday, October 6th in Chandler. And I'm not sure, 3 p.m. We'll post a link to that. They asked me to help see if we could get any friends from the Karchner family, that's Karchner is the name of the family whose land it was on when it was discovered in the 70s, and the Karchner family gave that land to the Arizona State Park System. So we've invited the Karchner family there. We've invited members of the Arizona State Park System there. So anyway, I'm kind of looking forward to this. It's not every day that a new piece of music is created to honor a natural feature of our landscape, and in this case, it's one of the Arizona State Parks, a cave system. So anyway, that's next Sunday, October 6th, in Chandler, Arizona, at 3 p.m. Vanya Nikolovsky, the conductor of the Chandler Symphony Orchestra, premiering the U.S. premiere of a new piece of music called Karchner Caverns Magic. I'm told it's about 16 minutes long. There's other musical pieces that the symphony will be playing. But anyway, that's next Sunday. And I think that's a piece of good news to see this Macedonian family that came over to Macedonia. I can't remember their story exactly, but they were born in Macedonia and came over here. And now he is enriching the lives of Americans, a Macedonian, enriching the lives of Americans with beautiful music that he has created.
Well, maybe they composed something for Matka Caverns as well. They're mostly flooded.
Yeah.
That's the side effect of of building the Matka Dam. But you can explore a little bit of it, and then the rest of it is actually used to try to set world records in deep diving through the caves. It's quite interesting. I think there are quite a few videos out of Matka online.
Yes, I think it's one of the deepest underwater cave systems in the world. I remember reading several years ago. I want to say they were Polish divers. I can't remember. Spelunkers, but diving spelunkers. Maybe there's a separate word for that. I don't know. That went in and explored it, and they still. And I understand they still haven't discovered all of the caves in Matka.
Sure.
So yeah, well, that's a good idea. I will suggest that to him.
No, it's pretty radical there.
Yeah, very cool. All right. Well, it's been fun, as always, talking, even though the subject matter was a bit dour, a bit depressing, a bit...
But it's our fault. We should have bought the scroll.
Yeah, it's the state of the affairs of the world today, but happy to end on a high note with that bit of news about the music. So anyway, we will catch up again next week.
Absolutely. Take care, buddy.
Hi.